What if awakening doesn't light you up? It empties you on purpose. And what if that emptiness is not depression at all, but the doorway your ego keeps labeling as failure? Pause for a moment. Notice how heavy that word emptiness feels in your body, like silence pressing against the inside of your chest, like the gravity of nothing pulling on every plan you once held so tightly. You expected awakening to ignite you, didn't you? A fire of passion, a rush of clarity, a surge of unstoppable purpose. But instead, it extinguished every flame you used to burn with. The career goals that once made you jump out of bed now taste like cardboard. The relationships that once defined you suddenly feel like masks, and the ambitions that once kept you running collapsed into dust. This is not your failure. This is the awakening paradox. The paradox Carl Jung mapped with precision. The more conscious you become, the more the illusions that once drove you dissolve. The more clearly you see, the more hollow the old game feels. The closer you move to truth, the less energy you have for lies. So here you are, empty still, and your ego whispers something is wrong with me. But listen closely, because nothing is wrong. In fact, everything is finally right. You didn't lose motivation by accident. It was stripped away the moment you saw through the illusion that once kept you running. Every goal you chased, every achievement you hungered for, every dream you thought was yours, wasn't truly yours at all. It was programmed into you long before you could question it. Think about it. The degree, the promotion, the perfect partner, the house, the money, the image of success, each one carried a hidden because. I want to succeed because then they'll respect me. I want to find love because I cannot face being alone. I want to build wealth because I'm terrified of scarcity. This wasn't real motivation. It was fear disguised as ambition. It was lack dressed up as desire. It was a mask of the persona, what Jung called the false self. A performance designed to keep you approved, applauded, and safe. So what happens when you wake up? When the veil lifts, that entire structure collapses. The machine stops running. The fuel disappears. And suddenly, nothing excites you. Not because you are broken, but because the engine you once relied on was never real. This is the paradox no one warns you about. Awakening doesn't add energy. It subtracts everything false. The job begins to feel meaningless. The applause feels hollow. The chase feels exhausting. And so you lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, asking, why can't I care anymore? But what if that question is sacred? What if the emptiness you fear is not the death of motivation, but the fertile soil where authentic purpose is waiting to be born? Carl Jung called this phase the blackening. In alchemy, it was known as the first fire. The stage where the old identity, the person you thought you were, must dissolve completely before anything new can emerge. It looks like apathy. It feels like nothing. But beneath the surface, everything is being broken down. This darkness is not a mistake. It is not a failure. It is a necessary part of transformation. Just as the caterpillar must liquefy inside its cocoon before wings can grow, your old sense of self must dissolve into formlessness. The emptiness you feel is not an ending. It is a chrysalis. Jung warned that most people misunderstand this stage. They think they are experiencing depression. They believe they've lost their way. They scramble to get their old motivation back, but trying to return to old desires after awakening is like trying to put a butterfly back into its cocoon. Not only is it impossible, it is a betrayal of your own evolution. The danger is that you will either force yourself back into ego-driven goals that no longer fit, or remain paralyzed in the void forever. Neither path leads to authentic living. The only way forward is through the blackening, through the darkness, through the silence, through the stillness that feels unbearable. Jung discovered that when this phase is navigated consciously, it becomes the very threshold into authentic purpose. What feels like the end of your story is actually the necessary dismantling of everything false. What looks like nothing is the very beginning of something real. Her name was Maria. She came to Carl Jung after what she described as the most profound spiritual experience of her life. For years she had been chasing enlightenment, through meditation, through books, through endless practices meant to dissolve the self. And then one day, during a deep meditation, it happened. She experienced what mystics call ego death. Her identity collapsed. Her sense of separation dissolved. She felt herself merge with the universe, limitless, eternal, complete. For weeks afterward, she was euphoric. She felt untouchable, radiant with truth. Nothing worried her, nothing disturbed her. She had touched the divine. But then the shift suddenly. She couldn't get out of bed. She stopped eating. She quit her job. She ended her relationships, not because she was sad, not because she was broken, but because she felt a profound indifference to everything she had once cared about. "I've seen the truth," she told Jung. "Nothing matters. Goals are illusions. Achievements are game. Love is attachment. Work is distraction. I cannot pretend anymore that any of it has meaning." Most teachers might have called this a breakdown. Jung did not. He recognized it for what it was: the blackening, the necessary death phase that must precede rebirth. Maria wasn't failing spiritually, she was dissolving psychologically. She was in the liminal space where the old identity is gone, but the new self has not yet been born. Jung understood this better than anyone because he had studied alchemy, not as primitive science but as a symbolic map of the psyche. And Maria was living it. She was the prima materia, the raw material, dissolving in the fire of transformation. Her emptiness was not pathology. It was initiation. Jung realized something unsettling as he worked with Maria. In the modern world, people could awaken too early. They could trigger the blackening through meditation, psychedelics, or intense spiritual practice, without the psychological framework to hold what they were entering. He called it premature enlightenment. It's like performing surgery on yourself without understanding anatomy. You cut too deep and suddenly you're bleeding in ways you cannot stop. Maria had pierced the veil. She had seen through the illusions of ego-driven life. But she had no idea how to live with this knowledge. She was, in Jung's words, psychologically homeless. Too awake to return to the old illusions, not yet integrated enough to live as her authentic self. This is the hidden danger of spiritual awakening. People believe they are signing up for permanent bliss. They think consciousness will bring constant clarity. They expect enlightenment to ignite passion. But Jung saw the opposite. True awakening often begins with collapse, with emptiness, with annihilation. He called this the threshold that must be crossed consciously. Without guidance, it can feel like falling into a void with no bottom. With guidance, it becomes the crucible where authentic purpose is forged. Maria's despair wasn't her end. It was her invitation, and Jung knew he couldn't try to restore her old motivations because they were dead. His task was to help her see the emptiness not as failure, but as sacred space, a chrysalis. The silence before rebirth, Jung began to see a pattern. Maria wasn't the only one. Patient after patient arrived with the same story, a breakthrough into higher consciousness, followed by a collapse into emptiness. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Then he realized it was the map. He called the process individuation, the death of the false self and the birth of the authentic self. But here's the part most people miss. The two selves do not overlap. When the false self dies, there is a gap before the real self takes form. And in that gap, life feels hollow. You are too awake to return to your old ways, but you are not yet born enough to know what comes next. Jung described it as a psychological limbo. You are suspended between two worlds. The ground beneath you has dissolved. The new earth has not yet risen. Most people panic here. They believe they are broken. They try to drag back their old ambitions, to glue together the mask that has already crumbled. But Jung warned, this is the most dangerous mistake, forcing yourself back into ego-driven goals is like reanimating a corpse. It may move, but it will never live. The task is not to rush. The task is to wait, to hold the void consciously, to let the blackening do its work. Because it is here, in this hollow silence, that the new self begins to stir. The seed under the soil, the embryo in the dark, the authentic self gathering strength before it breaks through. Individuation isn't about chasing. It's about surrendering to the space between death and rebirth. Through his work, Jung uncovered a truth most people never see. All human motivation falls into two categories: persona-driven or self-driven. Persona-driven motivation comes from the mask you wear to survive. The false self, the performer, it is powered by fear, by lack, by the need to be seen, to be safe, to be accepted. It is the student chasing grades to prove worth. The professional climbing ladders to escape insignificance. The lover seeking validation so they don't have to face their loneliness. Persona-driven motivation is loud, urgent, restless. It screams, if I don't achieve this, I am nothing. Self-driven motivation is entirely different. It emerges from your authentic core. It doesn't chase approval. It doesn't beg for safety. It arises like a whisper, like a current flowing through your being. It says, this is what I am. This is what I am here to express. It does not need recognition because the act itself is fulfillment. Here lies the paradox of awakening. When the mask falls, persona-driven motivation dies. The old engine stops, and for a time, there is nothing. The whisper of the authentic self has not yet arrived. You are left in a gap, no fire, no fuel, only silence. This is the stage where people panic. They confuse the death of false desire with the death of all desire. They believe they are lost when in truth, they are closer to themselves than ever, because once the persona's voice is gone, there is finally enough quiet for the soul to be heard. Jung discovered that this gap, the silence between who you were and who you are becoming, can last months, even years. It is the space most people cannot endure. They mistake it for failure. They label it as depression. They fight against it, desperate to reignite the fire of their old life. But this emptiness is not punishment. It is preparation. It is the psyche clearing space, stripping away what no longer belongs so that something authentic can rise. If you rush to fill the void, you miss its purpose. If you resurrect old ambitions, you bury your own rebirth. Jung called this period conscious waiting, the practice of holding the emptiness without panic, the willingness to sit in silence while the new voice gathers strength. He taught that authentic motivation cannot be forced. It cannot be summoned on command. It emerges only when the false has been fully composted. Most people never reach this. They relapse into ego-driven goals because they cannot bear the stillness. They strap their broken mask back on and march into the same cycle. But those who learn to wait, truly wait, begin to notice something subtle. Faint impulses, gentle stirrings, whispers that do not sound like ambition, but feel like truth. A desire to create, not to be applauded, but because creation itself feels alive. A call to serve, not to be admired, but because suffering moves the heart. These are not ego's demands. They are the soul's invitations. And when you learn to wait in the emptiness long enough, those whispers grow into the most powerful motivation you have ever known. When the old fuel is gone and the silence has stretched long enough, something extraordinary begins to happen. The void that once felt unbearable begins to soften. Out of the emptiness, a different kind of impulse arises, not loud, not demanding, not urgent, but steady, gentle, true. This is what Jung called soul motivation. Unlike the persona, it does not push you. It pulls you. It does not threaten. It invites. It does not scream, "You must do this." Instead, it whispers, "You were born for this." At first, it feels almost too quiet to notice. You wonder if you are imagining it. The impulse is fragile, like a flame flickering in a storm. But if you give it space, if you lean toward it without judgment, it grows. And as it grows, you realize it feels completely different from anything that ever drove you before. Ego motivation feels urgent, anxious, heavy. It weighs on the body like tension. It says, "If I don't achieve this, something terrible will happen." Soul motivation feels magnetic, inevitable, alive. You feel it in your chest as warmth, in your body as energy. It carries no threat, only recognition. One of Jung's patients described it this way: "I used to be moved by fear, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of being nothing. When that fuel died, I thought I was broken. But slowly, I wanted to create, not to impress anyone. But because creation felt like breathing, I wanted to help, not to be admired. But because compassion moved something deep inside me." This is the beginning of rebirth. The recognition that what calls you now is not external validation but internal truth. It does not need applause to exist. It does not need achievement to justify itself. It is enough simply because it comes from the deepest part of who you are. The void, once feared, reveals itself as the womb of your authentic life. Jung discovered that the journey from emptiness to authentic purpose is not random. It follows a pattern, 3 distinct stages of psychological alchemy: dissolution, coagulation, integration. Dissolution is the first stage. This is the blackening, the death of the old identity. Your false motivations collapse. The mask you wore for approval disintegrates. The ambitions that once carried you forward no longer hold power. It is the stage of endings, of emptiness, of the void. It feels like loss, but it is actually purification. Then comes coagulation. Out of the ashes of what has died, new impulses begin to form. They are not yet clear. They arrive as fragments, whispers, images, subtle movements of the heart. This is the early birth of soul motivation. It feels fragile, like seedlings breaking through soil. It cannot be forced. But if you protect it, it grows. Finally, integration. This is where the authentic self becomes the foundation of your life. The whispers solidify into a voice. The fragments form a pattern. The impulses align into a way of living that feels natural, inevitable, undeniable. You no longer need to perform. You no longer need to chase. You are moved by something deeper than fear, something more enduring than ambition. You are carried by your own essence. But here is what Jung emphasized. You cannot skip the stages. You cannot leap from awakening to purpose without passing through emptiness. You cannot harvest before the soil has been cleared. You cannot integrate before you dissolve. It is meant to be real. And if you allow yourself to move through each stage consciously, the purpose that emerges will be unshakable. Jung made a startling discovery. What most people call purpose is not purpose at all. It is survival dressed in disguise, a sophisticated ego defense. He found that 90% of what drives human behavior is not a true calling, but an attempt to avoid pain. The career you pursue to feel respected, the relationship you cling to so you don't feel abandoned, the wealth you chase to silence your fear of poverty. These are not authentic desires. They are compensations. They are the false fuel of the persona. Jung called this purpose poisoning, the illusion that if you achieve enough, gain enough, or become enough, the emptiness inside will finally disappear. But no external accomplishment can cure an internal wound. That is why people spend decades climbing ladders, only to arrive at the top and feel nothing. That is why success often ends in despair. The mask was satisfied, but the soul was untouched. When awakening comes, it burns through this illusion. It shows you that the goals you thought were meaningful were never yours. They were survival, strategies wrapped in shiny paper. You thought you were chasing dreams. In truth, you were running from wounds. This is why awakening kills motivation so brutally. It does not want you to waste another moment chasing shadows. It does not want you to keep pouring your life into a system of goals that could never fill you. It strips them away, leaving only the raw truth. And that truth is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying, because it feels like losing everything. Liberating, because for the first time in your life, you are free to discover what you actually want. The collapse of false purpose is not the end of your story. It is the clearing of the stage for your real life to begin. Jung understood that once false purposes collapse, the task is to learn how to tell the difference between what the ego demands and what the soul invites. He called this desire discrimination. Ego desires always carry a hidden because. I want to be successful because then people will respect me. I want to find love because I cannot stand being alone. I want to build wealth because I am terrified of being. It always bargains. Its desires are conditional, rooted in fear or lack. Soul desires stand alone. They need no justification. They arise not from scarcity, but from fullness. I want to create. I want to help. I want to explore. They do not ask permission. They do not explain themselves. They are not loud, but they are undeniable. Jung found that most people never experience soul desires because they have been conditioned since childhood to live in the logic of the persona. But awakening strips away those layers, and when you learn to sit in the emptiness without rushing to fill it, something pure begins to rise. Desires that do not argue for themselves. Desires that do not need applause. Desires that simply are. The art of desire discrimination is the foundation of authentic living. Without it, you relapse into the old game. With it, you begin to recognize the voice of your own soul. Jung discovered that most people prolong their suffering because they refuse to let their old motivations die. They cling to the ashes of a fire that has already gone out. They tell themselves, I should still want this. I should still care. I should still feel the drive I once had. But the truth is, those desires are gone, and no amount of effort will bring them back. That is why Jung taught the practice of conscious grieving. Instead of fighting to resurrect old ambitions, you mourn them. You honor what they gave you. You acknowledge the energy they once provided, and then you release them. One of Jung's patients wrote a letter to her former dream. I grieve the part of me that wanted to be famous. That desire gave me direction for years. It fueled my nights of practice, my sacrifices, my hunger. But now I see it was built on my need for attention, for validation, for love I never gave myself. I thank this desire for what it carried me through. And I release it. This kind of grieving is not weakness. It is courage. It is the conscious decision to cooperate with transformation instead of resisting it. When you grieve the death of your old purposes, you free yourself from their ghost. You no longer waste energy trying to breathe life into something that is already gone. The paradox is that by mourning what has died, you create space for what is waiting to be born. Once the old desires are grieved, the silence they leave behind can feel endless. Most people panic here, rushing to invent a new purpose just to escape the emptiness. But Jung taught a different way. He called it active imagination. Instead of forcing answers, you open a dialogue with the deeper parts of yourself. You sit quietly and ask a simple question, what wants to be born through me? And then you wait. Not with your mind straining for logic, not with your ego scrambling for certainty, but with your awareness softened, receptive, ready to hear whispers. At first, the responses may be faint. An image, a phrase, a feeling. One patient Jung worked with began seeing visions of herself teaching children outdoors. She dismissed it at first, convinced it was fantasy. She had no background in teaching, no rational plan to make it real. But Jung urged her to listen, to honor the image without judgment. Within months, she found herself volunteering with environmental education programs. She discovered that the impulse was not random. It was a calling. For the first time in years, she felt alive again. Not because she was chasing status or achievement, but because she was answering something genuine within. Active imagination is not about inventing your future. It is about learning to trust what arises when the ego finally stops shouting. The question is not, what do I want to do? The question is, What wants to be done through me? When you begin to live from that question, the emptiness becomes possibility. The void becomes the womb, and your life shifts from striving to listening. Jung noticed that when people began listening to these subtle impulses, life itself started to change. Choices no longer came from strategy or obligation, but from energy. He called this symbolic living. Symbolic living means paying attention to what calls to you, even if it makes no logical sense. It means noticing where your energy rises and where it means letting curiosity guide you more than duty, and letting fascination carry more weight than fear. Most people live as slaves to obligation. They force themselves into routines, into careers, into relationships that drain them, because they believe that is what a responsible life requires. But when you are in symbolic living, responsibility takes a different form. You are no longer responsible for meeting everyone's expectations. You are responsible for answering the impulses that come from the deepest part of you. This doesn't make you less effective. In fact, Jung found the opposite. People living symbolically often accomplished more than those driven by fear, because their actions were aligned with their essence. They weren't wasting energy fighting themselves. They were moving with the current of their own nature. To live symbolically is to live as if the universe is speaking in hints, in synchronicities, in signs. It is to follow the threads that light up inside you, even when they do not fit into neat plans. It is to trust that the intelligence that dissolves your false identity is the same intelligence that will reveal your true direction. Symbolic living turns life into a dialogue, not a performance, and once you taste it, the old way of forcing yourself through obligation feels like a prison you will never return to. Jung realized that the transition from ego-driven desires to soul-driven purpose requires what he called a kind of motivational fasting. Just as the body sometimes needs to fast to cleanse itself, the psyche needs periods where you refrain from forcing direction, where you resist the urge to invent new goals just to feel busy. Most people cannot tolerate this. The moment they lose motivation, they scramble to fill the silence. They sign up for a new course. They start a new business. They chase a new relationship, anything to avoid the void. But in doing so, they drown out the very impulses that are trying to rise. Motivational fasting is the discipline of waiting without rushing, of clearing inner space so that authentic impulses have room to appear. It is choosing not to panic when nothing excites you. It is choosing to trust that beneath the silence, something real is gathering. During this fast, you may feel restless. You may even feel lost. But those feelings are only the ego protesting its death. The truth is, this emptiness is not a void. It is a womb. It is not the absence of purpose. It is the clearing of false purposes, so the true one can finally emerge. Jung found that when his patients endured this fast consciously, they began to sense new motivations unlike anything they had felt before. Not the anxious urgency of ego, but the quiet inevitability of the soul. Not the push of fear, but the pull of truth. Motivational fasting is the bridge between the death of the old and the birth of the new. It is the silence before the song, the stillness before the movement, the dark soil before the seed breaks open. Jung noticed that the greatest confusion people face after awakening is mistaking the signals of the ego for the whispers of the soul. To navigate this, he taught that the difference is not intellectual, it is felt. Ego motivation feels urgent. It comes with pressure in the mind and tension in the body. It says, I have to do this or I will lose everything. It is fueled by fear, scarcity, and the desperate need to be enough. You can recognize it by the anxiety it carries, by the way it weighs on you, even as it pushes you forward. Soul motivation feels entirely different. It is calm, magnetic. It doesn't scream. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't demand. It invites. It whispers. I get to do this because it is what I am. Instead of tension, it brings a sense of warmth in the chest, energy in the body, aliveness in the spirit. It doesn't drain you. It fills you. One of Jung's patients described it perfectly. Before awakening, he worked day and night to build his business, believing he was driven by passion. But when the illusions fell, he realized every late night, every sacrifice, every deal was fueled by fear of being a failure. That fear kept him running, but it also kept him exhausted. After awakening, when that fear dissolved, he felt lost. But slowly, new impulses arose. Not to prove himself, not to outpace his fears, but to contribute, to create, to serve. This is the distinction Jung insisted on. Ego motivation burns you out because it comes from emptiness trying to fill itself. Soul motivation energizes you because it comes from fullness trying to express itself. Ego pushes, soul pulls. Ego demands, soul invites. The task is not to think your way to purpose, but to feel your way into it. As Jung worked with more patients, he noticed a profound shift. When soul motivation finally emerged, it no longer looked like traditional ambition. It wasn't about climbing ladders, collecting achievements, or proving anything. It was something deeper. He called it ontological motivation. Motivation that flows not from what you lack, but from what you are. One of his patients, David, embodied this shift. Before his awakening, David became a lawyer. On the surface, it seemed like a noble path, but underneath, his drive was fueled by fear. Fear of disappointing his parents, fear of financial insecurity, fear of not being enough. That fear carried him through years of study, years of sacrifice. But once awakening stripped the fear away, his entire sense of drive collapsed. He could not summon the energy to care about law anymore. For months, David felt directionless. But then something unexpected happened. He began walking in nature. At first, it seemed pointless. Just long, slow walks among trees. But during those walks, new ideas began to surface. Visions of protecting forests, of conserving landscapes, of working with the earth instead of against. It feels like remembering something I always knew. This is the essence of ontological motivation. It does not push you toward what you fear losing. It draws you into what you already are. It does not arise from scarcity, but from abundance. It does not feel like effort for survival. It feels like expression of being. When you are moved by ontological motivation, you are no longer chasing purpose. You are embodying it. Life stops being about becoming and starts being about revealing. You are not driven by the anxiety of who you are. You are inspired by the inevitability of who you are. This is the shift that turns emptiness into power. Jung saw that when people crossed the threshold fully, something extraordinary occurred. Purpose was no longer something they chased. It became something that moved through them. He called this incarnated purpose, the moment when your authentic essence finds expression through your human life. This is not about building a career, following a trend, or forcing passion. It is about becoming a channel for what wants to emerge through you. You are no longer trying to live your life. You are letting life live through you. One of Jung's patients, Elena, illustrated this perfectly. Before her awakening, she was a successful marketing executive. Her days were filled with ambition, deadlines, strategies. On paper, she had inside, she was empty. After awakening, she lost all interest in the corporate climb. For 2 years, she drifted, paralyzed by the void. Then slowly, she felt a pull toward something unexpected. Painting at first, it was nothing serious. She painted on weekends, with no intention of showing her work. But the act of creating itself felt like breathing. Her paintings began to carry a strange energy. People who saw them felt healed, moved, restored. Elena realized her calling wasn't to be a marketing leader. It wasn't even to become a professional artist. It was to bring healing through beauty. This is incarnated purpose. It doesn't begin with strategy. It begins with surrender. It does not ask what it asks, what longs to be expressed through me. And when you answer that, your work ceases to drain you. It energizes you. It doesn't require endless willpower. It flows naturally because it is not separate from who you are. When you reach incarnated purpose, you stop striving to fit into life. You become the very expression of life itself. Jung's final and most radical insight was this: the emptiness that follows awakening is not the absence of purpose. It is the presence of purpose, so pure that your ego cannot yet recognize it. What feels like nothing is actually everything. Hidden, waiting, gestating. He compared it to pregnancy. From the inside, something miraculous is forming. The void you are in is not a grave, it is a womb. It is not death, it is preparation for birth. What you call depression may in truth be the earliest stirring of your authentic life. But here is the challenge. You must learn to wait without panic. You must resist the urge to fill the silence with counterfeit goals. You must trust the process. Your mind cannot understand, because purpose cannot be manufactured. It can only be revealed. The awakening did not kill your motivation. It killed your limitations. It stripped away everything false, so that what is real could finally appear. And if you stay with the silence, if you honor the void, if you allow the old to decompose completely, you will emerge with a purpose so authentic, so unshakable, that no circumstance can destroy it. This is why Jung urged his patients not to flee the emptiness, but to honor it, to sit in it, to listen, to ask each day what wants to be born through me, and to trust whatever whispers arrive. You are not broken for losing your old motivations. You are being prepared. You are being rewoven from the inside out, and when the new voice arrives, it will not sound like ambition. It will sound like recognition, like home. So if you are in the void, remember this: you are not empty. You are pregnant with possibility. Something beautiful is being born through you. Write in the comments, "I trust the process." Let the world know you understand the truth. That spiritual emptiness is the beginning. And if you're ready to go deeper into Jung's insights, watch my next video, where I reveal his warning about the final trick of the ego and why understanding it may save your psychological freedom. Thank you for watching. Stay awake, and I'll see you in the next dimension.